The first person shooter or FPS genre has existed pretty much since the third dimension started to come into play in video game making. Since its inception, it has been one of the most popular genres in all of video gaming history, and with the passage of time and improvement in technology, the genre has evolved as well. And in this video, we take a few steps back to look through its history. Before getting into the video, let's first establish what a first person shooter would be. A first person shooter is any game that would be played from the player's perspective, that is, the first person, and the primary way to complete the objectives of the game is through a projectile of sorts that originates from the player character, meaning that a tank shooter or a first person game with not necessarily a gun on the screen is also considered a first person shooter. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. 1970s to 1980s. Most people associate Wolfenstein as being the first FPS game made, but in reality, there were quite a few first person shooters made before it. The first ever FPS game was actually made all the way back in 1973, a whole 19 years before Wolfenstein released. And to answer the question many of you may have been asking, no, computers at this time weren't powerful enough to render 3D games, neither were the arcades at this time. While it's true that the general public did not have access to computers powerful enough, NASA did. Yes, you heard it right. The organization that sends people to the moon was also the first stepping stone to your Call of Duty games. The game Maze Wars was created by high school students Steve Colley, Greg Thompson, and Howard Palmer, who were on a work study program at NASA. The game was created for the IMLAC PSD-1 mini computer. Graphics may not look anything astounding by today's standards, but just the idea of making a game in 3 dimensions was pretty revolutionary at that time. The game could be played with up to 16 players over LAN and turn the camera in increments of 90 degrees horizontally to move through the maze. The frame changed each time you moved, so the movement wasn't smooth, but it had started the genre. One interesting detail that I found about this game is that it gave players the ability to peek from corners. During the 1970s, this was the only FPS game that was made. From 1980 to 1990, first-person shooters started becoming available to the public as well. Atari Battlezone, released in 1980, was the first commercial first-person shooter as well as the first FPS on the arcade. The game featured tank-based combat where the players shot down other tanks using missiles with the help of a small radar scanner, while the AI tanks tried to take out the player. The graphics were still simple vector graphics, but many more shapes than just walls could be made. During the time period, the first FPS game for PC, MIDI Maze, was also released in 1987 for the Atari ST computers. This was the first FPS to feature any sort of colors besides green and black. The game had pretty much the same concept as Maze Wars. Players drop into a maze and shoot each other to gain points, although a major difference was that it allowed players free and smooth movement of the camera along the horizontal axis. The connections in the game weren't over LAN but were rather over Atari's MIDI ports through daisy chaining, hence the name MIDI Maze. The game is credited for being the origination of the deathmatch format in FPS shooters. Although the game wasn't massively popular, it did gain a cult following. The game paved the way for the boom in the FPS genre that was to come in the 1990s. During the early 90s, the first-person genre took off quite rapidly on the PC thanks to id Software and the raycasting engine. Catacomb 3D was the first game in this time frame released by id in 1991. Sprites, textures, and colors started becoming used in games. The surroundings and enemies started getting more details, but the roofs and floor were still blank. The game featured spell-based combat and level-based progression system. A year later, id released Wolfenstein 3D, which became the landmark point in first-person shooter history. The game gave the genre what most people associate it with: a gun. On a technical level, it was pretty similar to Catacomb 3D. The very next year, with their updated Doom engine, id created the iconic Doom franchise. The upgraded Doom engine had the capability to make levels that had vertical player movement, for example, stairs and elevators, which weren't possible in the previous games. It also gave textures to the previously empty floor and roof. Doom also featured PvP deathmatches via LAN. In 1994, Bungie released Marathon. This was the first game to use the keyboard and mouse controls that would later become standard for FPS games. Before this, all the controls for games were binded to the keyboard only. During this time, FPS games started becoming more popular on the PC platform. The game centered around fast-paced combat, and the concept of deathmatch started becoming more popular, working upon the base laid by games like MIDI Maze. The games in this generation were made from raycasting, which wasn't true 3D, but rather an illusion of the third dimension. The first true 3D game came on the PC in 1996. in the form of Quake, another game released by id Software. Unlike its predecessor Doom, the Quake engine could render real-time 3D graphics, which at that time was nothing short of revolutionary. The game also had a great physics system for the time. Quake featured the same formula of fast paced combat as its predecessors. Besides the great single player, the game also featured an online multiplayer. This could be done by players setting up servers on their personal computers. Players could either play against each other in PvP matches or play the game together in co op. The game also pioneered some video gaming tactics like bunny hopping, strafe jumping, and rocket jumping that are still used in quite a lot of games till today. This was also the time that other major first person shooters started emerging that weren't made by id, like Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six released in 1997. Rainbow Six tried breaking the mold of the first person shooters at that time, trading the fast paced, action packed gameplay for slower tactical gameplay. The game tried to be realistic. The player could die with a single hit of a bullet. In the single player mode, the game had players going through missions, while in multiplayer, players could play together in a player versus environment situation or play against each other in a PvP match. Another game released during this time, Duke Nukem 3D in 1996, was praised for its interactable environment. During this time, a lot more narrative based or story driven first person shooters that focused quite a bit more on the story than the action and combat, like Half-Life and System Shock 2, also started coming up. FPS games also started appearing on consoles, like GoldenEye 007, a game based on the James Bond franchise, which was made for the Nintendo 64 console. In 1999, Epic Games made Barack Obama from Fortnite. No, actually, they made Unreal Tournament. This was the first game that really focuses on expanding the roster of game modes available from just deathmatch. Later that same year, Quake 3 was released, this time without having a single player campaign but rather having bot matches as its single player option. In 2000, the first Counter-Strike game was released. The game was first made as a mod of the game Half-Life by Min Lee and Jesse Cliff, and was later acquired by Valve, the makers of Half-Life. The gameplay of the game at that time was the same as it is today. This is not exactly an improvement, but rather just a small detail. During this time, the gun models on the screen went from being right in the center of the screen to rather being on the right hand side to make it look a little bit more realistic. The 2000s was a pretty big decade for first person shooters. To start the decade, Bungie released Halo Combat Evolved in 2001 on the Xbox 360. Halo is credited for making the FPS genre mainstream on consoles. During this time, military shooters like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Medal of Honor, etc. started getting popular. These games aimed to simulate realism rather than absurd stories. They also laid more emphasis on team-based PvP rather than PvP based on one-on-one player combat. FPS games also started to get open world features, like in the case of Far Cry 1, released by Crytek in 2004. Crytek also released Crysis in 2007, a game that was ahead of its time on both graphics and the hardware it was meant for, hence spawning the Can It Run Crysis meme. Co-op games also started getting more popular with the likes of Left 4 Dead. Basically at this point, any genre that you can think about was getting mixed with FPS. Story-based games like Bioshock, FPS puzzle games like Half-Life 2 and Portal, horror games like Fear, looter shooters like Borderlands. There were multiplayer only games as well, like Team Fortress 2 by Valve in 2007 and CS Source also by Valve in 2004, which were both great success. Military first-person shooters was a dominant subgenre at this time due to the massive success of games like Modern Warfare 2 and Battlefield. There was also a lot of experimentation going around at this time, but by the 2010s, the basic layout had been laid. There weren't many groundbreaking changes made after this point. During the 2010s, most of the improvement came in the form of graphics. By this time, multiplayer was a core essential to have for any game. And another thing that was common now was the companies providing dedicated servers for said multiplayer games instead of you having to make one on the computer in your mom's basement. Solely multiplayer titles like CSGO and Siege were becoming more of a thing now. The game started getting more and more of a competitive aspect with the emergence of esports. Military shooters were still as popular as ever. With the massive improvements in technology that took place, games like Battlefield 4 were able to hold large-scale servers with hundreds of players at a single time and simulating large-scale destructions that could completely change how you played on a map. Multiplayer gaming started evolving into more subgenres like tactical shooters, examples CSGO and Rainbow Six Siege, hero shooters like Overwatch and Valorant. Unfortunately though, the genre that started making multiplayer popular, arena shooters, is as good as dead at this point. Battle Royale was another genre that became incredibly popular with games like PUBG, Warzone and Apex Legends. There were also games with amazing gameplay that weren't able to find much mainstream success, unfortunately, but still remain cult classics like Titanfall 2. There are a lot more popular games during this time frame, like Doom, that came back after an almost 15-year hibernation period and gave a breath of fresh air, bringing the old fast-paced, action-packed combat back into the market that was looking overly saturated with tactical and open-world games. Speaking of the future, the FPS genre isn't going anywhere anytime soon, or in fact, I don't think it's going anywhere at all ever, with tons of future projects that people are eagerly anticipating, although they have been let down quite a lot in recent times. It's safe to say that the future looks promising. Whether the promises are fulfilled or are left in the void like 60% of games are at this point, we will only be able to know when the time comes. And that about covers everything up. Hope you liked the video, and if you did, do leave a like and subscribe to the channel. These videos take quite a while to make, so a subscribe or a share to your friends does help out a lot. With that being said, I'll see you in the next one.